Have you ever experienced something that has felt pretty difficult at the time, or maybe even a little later, but you've dealt with it by telling yourself something along the line of, it wasn't really that bad, could have been a lot worse. Other people experience things so much worse than that. It's not really that big of a deal. If so, it could be really sabotaging all the work that you're trying to do to heal. So today's video is for you. Hi, thanks for watching. I'm Peggy Oliveira. So what I was just referring to, those examples that I gave, are ways that we minimize our experiences. One of my most watched videos, or actually I think the most watched video, is on coping mechanisms. And I talked about 4 ways that we tend to cope as survivors of childhood trauma. These are actually relevant to people no matter what their history is, but they play a really significant role for trauma survivors. So today I wanted to talk to you about minimizing in particular. So if you've watched the other video, and there will be a link to that video in the description, but if you've watched that other video, I go into what minimizing is and kind of why it's problematic. But today is all about minimizing, and I want to share with you what it is, but also why it's so important that we don't do it. And what do we do instead? So minimizing is a natural way of coping, and like I said, most of us do it to some extent. But minimizing trauma, minimizing wounding is really detrimental for a few different reasons. But what it looks like are some of the examples that I gave at the introduction. But it's a way of making ourselves feel like what we're trying to deal with is really not that big. It helps us feel a little bit better about whatever that wound is, whatever that fear is. It serves a really important purpose. It truly does. There's nothing wrong with the fact that we minimize. Certainly nothing to be ashamed of. But when we tell ourselves that it wasn't that bad, or we compare our experience to somebody else's and say, well, compared to that, it's nothing, so therefore it really shouldn't bother me that much. And that's where we get into trouble, because when we minimize it, we're doing that to tell ourselves that we shouldn't be that bothered by it. We shouldn't be affected by it. We shouldn't feel upset about it. We shouldn't be sad about it, which again serves a purpose when we need it, because to feel into all of those feelings was not really available to us as children. But the problem with that is that we are feeling it. Our body is feeling that. That energy is swirling around. We know that we feel afraid and hurt and all of those things, but we're telling ourselves that we shouldn't because it's really not that big of a deal. Talk about creating problems of self-trust and honoring how we feel and knowing how we feel, which is a whole other issue that I'll cover another time. But that causes us to really believe that we're not affected by something, that whatever it is shouldn't be making us feel bad, that we shouldn't be struggling because of it. And the impact that that has on us is the trust, the self-trust that I mentioned a moment ago. But it makes us feel like there's something really wrong with us, that we're weak, that we just aren't as strong as other people, or therefore deserving as other people. Because if this really isn't a big deal and I'm struggling with it, or it's still affecting me, then what does that say about me? Well, it says you're normal, but in your mind, what you believe that it says about you is that you're weak, that you're damaged, that nobody could ever love you. All of those things and plenty more. And you believe that. That reinforces your underlying core belief of not being worthy, not being good enough. part of healing requires us to no longer minimize. Because if we're minimizing it, we aren't really able to recognize the significance of what it is we need to heal, or the significance of the impact that it's had on us. I shared in a recent video about my own experience when my husband called 911. And I mentioned in there how I had really told myself that I wasn't affected by it because I told myself it wasn't that bad. Well, I hadn't heard a lot of stories at that point. I knew that there were far worse things that could happen. And so I shouldn't be affected by that. That had a profound impact on my sense of shame that I carried. Because what was wrong with me? If it wasn't that big of a deal, why was I struggling so much? So part of healing is being able to really acknowledge the fact that it is a big deal. Any wounding that we experience is a big deal. It doesn't have to be a big deal on the spectrum of things that people can experience for it to be a big deal to us. Or even a big deal to somebody who is on the spectrum of really bad things that can happen. Like hundreds of bad things, thousands of bad things. Because anything that creates a wound for you matters. And if we're denying that by minimizing, then we don't ever really have the opportunity to heal the actual wound. We try to put band-aids on things just so that we can seem stronger, more together. And that's not how we heal. So minimizing is making what you've experienced or felt seem insignificant, that it doesn't really matter, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, shouldn't have that much impact. We do it because it allows us to not think anyway that we're feeling all of that stuff. And that happens automatically. We don't make a decision to minimize, at least not in the beginning. So what do we do? What do we ultimately do when we recognize that we're minimizing? Well, the first thing is to recognize that you're minimizing, being able to say, wow, I've always thought that this wasn't a big deal. I've always thought that this didn't affect me. Whatever it is that you said to yourself. And actually, it did hurt. It did feel painful. It did impact me. Whatever feels relevant for you. So an acknowledgement, right? Because you can't heal what you deny is wounded. So an acknowledgement that that thing that you thought was not really a big deal or shouldn't affect you as much as it does, it is a big deal. And it's natural that you're affected by it. Especially for anybody listening who has experienced trauma. Anybody who is listening who has experienced childhood uncertainty, poverty, dysfunction, mental illness of your caretakers, a lack of safety in your environment, feeling hungry. All of that is about uncertainty. So anything that created any of that for you is a big deal. It's a big deal because it has had an impact on how you view yourself, how you feel about your life, and what is available to you. So, acknowledgement is first, and then the reality is that much of the time, when we acknowledge that truth, it can feel painful. It can feel even a bit overwhelming depending on what it is we're acknowledging. But as I've said in other videos, you've already lived through that. So it's not that you have to live through it again. It's just an acknowledgement that it makes sense that you feel some of the things that you feel, that you struggle in some of the ways that you struggle, that even when you've read the books and done the things, that it hasn't actually changed a whole lot because you haven't been able to heal the actual thing that caused the wound. Because you've minimized it and thought it wasn't a big deal. But in acknowledging it, in allowing yourself to look at and connect the dots of the impact that it's had, there's healing that happens in that. And then you're able to really understand and heal that experience or those experiences. And I want to be clear that minimizing has a place, especially when you have no alternatives, when you don't have any ability to control anything that's going on in your life. It serves an important purpose. Even in our adult lives, there are times that minimizing can play a role. Now, it doesn't help us in the long run, because the whole idea of denying the reality and we can't heal it. But there's no shame in it. There's nothing to feel bad about. But to live our lives from a place of openness and freedom, we have to be able to acknowledge the reality that some of those things that you've been telling yourself your whole life are not a big deal, they actually are. The things that you've been telling yourself that really shouldn't bother you, either then or now, well, there's a really good chance that it makes complete sense that it did and it does. And there's self-compassion in that. And self-compassion is necessary for healing as well. So being intentional about how you speak to yourself about different experiences. So check in with yourself, whether it's about past stuff or current stuff that's going on in your life. Do you tend to minimize? Have you used it as a way of kind of separating yourself from the reality of a different experiences? Is it one of the ways that you compare to other people? Share in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you found this video helpful, please consider sharing it so other people can find it too. And of course, if you haven't yet subscribed, please make sure to do so and click the little bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.